The sky over the Pacific was endless, a vast, cruel expanse, where courage was measured in seconds, and survival often hung by the thinnest thread. In those early days of World War II, American pilots faced an enemy that seemed almost impossible to defeat. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan's nimble and deadly fighter plane, tore through the air with speed and agility that left U.S. pilots scrambling, frustrated, and terrified. Dogfights became nightmares. Entire squadrons vanished in the blink of an eye, their bravery swallowed by the unforgiving blue above. The Zero wasn't just a plane. It was a symbol of Japanese mastery in the sky, a perfect storm of engineering and deadly instinct. Light, fast, and able to turn inside its own wingspan, it outmaneuvered anything the Americans could throw at it. Their aircraft, like the F-4F Wildcat, were heavier, slower, and less agile. Pilots tried everything: tight turns, climbing dives, even brute force attacks, but the results were always the same. They lost pilots faster than they could train replacements, and morale plummeted with every mission. In the beginning, American commanders thought the problem was simple: just fight harder, push the planes to their limits, and train more aggressively. But the truth was more complicated. No matter how skilled a pilot was, the Zero had an almost magical quality in combat. Its lightweight frame and unmatched maneuverability allowed Japanese pilots to execute moves that American minds could barely comprehend. If you tried to dogfight a Zero on its terms, you were already losing. It was in this desperate, tense environment that the story of one unusual pilot began, a story that didn't start with sophisticated plans or secret blueprints, but with something as ordinary as a box of matchsticks. While others had their heads in technical manuals and performance charts, this pilot was observing the world in a way that no one else had dared to. He studied patterns, angles, and movements. He didn't just look at his plane. He watched the enemy's plane like a puzzle waiting to be solved. It started with small observations. During training exercises, he noticed that the Zero's turns were not limitless. They were sharp, yes, but only under certain conditions. Its wings, while perfect for maneuverability, had limits dictated by physics, speed, weight distribution, and the forces acting on the aircraft during a high-speed turn. He realized that most American pilots were flying under the illusion that the Zero was invincible. But it wasn't. No machine is. This pilot, determined to find an advantage, began using the simplest tools at his disposal. On his desk, he lined up matchsticks to represent the planes in combat. He moved them slowly, imitating turns, climbs, and dives. Each stick represented a moment in the sky, each angle a potential opportunity or deadly mistake. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to see patterns emerge, patterns that no textbook, no flight manual, and no conventional training had ever revealed. The breakthrough came when he discovered the concept of energy advantage, a principle that would later become legendary in American aviation. While the Zero could outturn him, it could not outdive him. In a dive, the heavier American planes could pick up speed and maintain control, whereas the lightweight Zero risked losing stability. The matchsticks showed him angles and positions where his plane could strike, retreat, and strike again, all without trying to mimic the Zero's impossible maneuvers. This wasn't just a clever idea. It was a revolution in thinking. Until that moment, American pilots had been playing a game they could never win. They were fighting the Zero on its own terms, and the cost was devastating. But with this simple, almost childlike experiment using matchsticks, the impossible suddenly became possible. As news of this discovery began to spread quietly through the squadrons, hope returned to the pilots. Suddenly, there was a strategy, a method, a way to fight back. They didn't have to fear the Zero as an unbeatable predator. They could outsmart it. Each dogfight became less a desperate struggle and more a calculated chess match, with altitude, speed, and positioning as the pieces on the board. The story of how matchsticks changed the course of aerial combat isn't just a story about planes or tactics. It's a story about human ingenuity under pressure. In the darkest days, when every mission felt like a death sentence, it was a mind willing to observe, experiment, and innovate that saved lives and turned the tide in the Pacific. It proved that sometimes the smallest ideas, an ordinary object in the hands of the right person, can rewrite history. And so, the stage was set. The Americans had found a weakness, a hidden truth about the Zero that no one had seen before. But knowing the solution was only the beginning. The next challenge was far greater, applying it in the chaos of real combat, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. This is the story of that pilot, the matchsticks, and the turning point that gave American airmen the edge. They desperately needed a story of courage, intellect, and the relentless pursuit of survival against overwhelming odds. It is a story that would define a generation of pilots and change the face of aerial warfare forever. The first time this pilot took his newfound strategy into the air, he felt a mix of anticipation and unease. Everything he had learned with matchsticks and diagrams now had to be tested against the deadly reality of combat. The Pacific was unforgiving, and the Zero remained a formidable foe, but he had discovered a principle that could turn the tide. Fight on your own terms, not theirs. American squadrons were scattered across tiny islands and aircraft carriers, constantly under threat from Japanese air raids. Pilots who had returned from missions spoke in hushed tones about the Zero's terrifying agility. They recounted narrow escapes, where their planes felt sluggish and unresponsive, while the enemy danced around them effortlessly. Morale was fragile. The thought of a young pilot, armed only with an understanding born from matchsticks and observation, stepping into this deadly theater, seemed almost reckless. Yet, it was exactly what the Americans needed. On his first engagement, he approached a squadron of Zeros with caution. He climbed higher than the enemy, letting gravity and the weight of his aircraft become allies rather than obstacles. The Zeros immediately tried to draw him into a turning fight, a mistake he had predicted from his experiments. As he dove, his plane gained speed, slicing through the air with precision. The enemy, agile but light, struggled to maintain control at these velocities. Every movement he had modeled with matchsticks unfolded perfectly before his eyes. The pilot began to teach his tactics to others. They called it energy fighting, a method where altitude and speed replaced reckless dogfighting as the keys to survival. Pilots learned to maintain the high ground, to let the enemy waste energy in tight turns, and then strike decisively. It was a game of physics and timing, not sheer bravery. And for the first time, the Americans had the upper hand. But these lessons were not easy to master. Pilots had to retrain their instincts, which had been honed for years under the assumption that turning to outmaneuver the enemy was the best strategy. Many resisted at first, clinging to old methods that had failed them again and again. Yet, as they watched colleagues survive where previously they would have been lost, skepticism gave way to awe. The matchstick pilots' insights were more than theory, they were life-saving practice. It wasn't just in dogfights that the method proved effective. The strategy also changed the way pilots approached missions. They began to tease, I think, several moves ahead, like chess players in the sky. Dive, climb, reposition, strike. Every maneuver was deliberate, calculated, and based on a deep understanding of how the Zero responded under pressure. The sky became a battlefield of wits, as much as firepower. Interestingly, some of the most significant results came not from direct kills, but from survival. Pilots who followed these tactics returned from missions with fewer scratches and dents on their planes, and fewer comrades lost. Each safe landing was a victory in itself, a testament to the power of observation, planning and intelligence over sheer aggression. The Japanese pilots, on the other hand, noticed a change. Where once American planes had been predictable and easy prey, now they were cautious, elusive, and dangerous in entirely new ways. The element of surprise had shifted. The Zeros could still maneuver, still execute incredible feats of agility. But the Americans had learned to exploit the very limitations that had once been invisible to them. The once dominant predator was now being studied and outsmarted. It was during one of these encounters that the pilot's strategy was put to the ultimate test. A small group of American fighters engaged a larger formation of Zeros near a remote island. The odds were against them, and panic threatened to take over. But the pilot's approach worked flawlessly. By climbing above the enemy, diving strategically, and using the energy advantage he had discovered with Matchsticks, he and his squadron were able to disrupt the Zeros' formations, take calculated shots, and retreat safely when needed. The results stunned everyone. Not only did they survive, but they inflicted damage that would have been unthinkable just months before. News of these victories traveled fast. Pilots from other squadrons began to adopt the method, practicing in simulators and classrooms with the same meticulous attention to angles, energy, and timing. The Matchsticks had inspired a broader shift in American aerial tactics, a quiet revolution that was slowly eroding the myth of Zero invincibility. There were also fascinating technical observations that emerged from these engagements. Pilots noted that Zeros could not sustain high-speed dives for long without risking structural stress. They could outturn almost anything in tight combat, but long, drawn-out maneuvers exposed weaknesses. By mapping these vulnerabilities, the Americans transformed from reactive fighters into proactive strategists. Each mission became a blend of courage, calculation, and chemistry between pilot and machine. Even in moments of chaos, the method held. Pilots found themselves intuitively remembering the angles and positions the Matchsticks had taught them. Decisions that once would have been panicked now flowed naturally. The lessons of geometry, gravity, and momentum became instinctual, as if the sky itself had been decoded. By the end of this phase, the Americans had turned what had once been a devastating disadvantage into a tactical edge. The Zero was still deadly, still a masterpiece of design, but it was no longer unbeatable. And all of it, every life saved, every victory won, traced back to the simple yet brilliant insight of a pilot who refused to accept the accepted wisdom, who looked at a problem from a different angle, and who found the answer in the humblest of tools, Matchsticks. The stage was now set for the final chapter, where innovation, courage, and human determination would collide in the air over the Pacific, culminating in battles that would prove once and for all that understanding, not just bravery, could tip the scales in war. The sun rose over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the waves, a reminder that each day could be the last for the men in the sky. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation, as the Americans prepared for another mission. By now, the pilot strategy had spread quietly among squadrons, but theory and practice were two very different things. There was no room for mistakes, no margin for error. The Zero remained a deadly adversary, and every pilot knew it. The mission began like so many others, with engines roaring and planes slicing through the blue horizon. Suddenly, a formation of Zeros appeared, glinting in the sun, their pilots calm and confident, unaware that the Americans were no longer easy prey. The first instinct for many pilots might have been panic, but this time they followed the Matchstick pilot's guidance, climbing higher, maintaining energy, and positioning themselves where the enemy's advantage would become a liability. The dogfight erupted, a ballet of danger, skill, and instinct. The Zeros twisted and turned, trying to lure the American planes into close maneuvers, the very kind of fight that had claimed so many lives in the past. But this time was different. The Americans didn't bite. They kept their composure, diving when necessary, climbing strategically, and using speed to strike. Each move was calculated, every angle considered, the invisible lessons of matchsticks manifesting in real time. For the first time, the American pilots could see the enemy struggling. The Zeros, once untouchable in tight turns, were forced to overextend. Their speed in dives was limited by their lightweight frames. Their agility, deadly and confined maneuvers, became predictable when the Americans maintained altitude and momentum. Slowly, methodically, the tide was turning. Amidst the chaos, the matchstick pilot himself engaged a Zero head-on. The enemy pilot, skilled and aggressive, expected the usual mistakes: tight turns, reactive maneuvers, desperate attacks. But he found none. The American pilot stayed calm, positioning his plane with precision, striking when the moment was perfect. In a heartbeat, the Zero was down, spiraling toward the ocean. There was no celebration, no triumphant gesture, only a silent acknowledgement that years of nunderdishin of describe, frustration, fear, and failure had finally been overcome. This was repeated over the next several missions. Squadrons that had once been terrified of the Zeros now flew with a renewed sense of confidence. They had learned to respect the enemy, but no longer feared it as invincible. Each engagement reinforced the lessons first discovered, with matchsticks on a desk: fight on your terms, exploit weaknesses, and never underestimate the power of observation and innovation. The impact of this strategy went beyond individual dogfights. Commanders began rethinking tactics, training new pilots to fly smarter, not just faster. Carrier operations, squadron formations, and mission planning all adapted to the new understanding. What started as a simple experiment had grown into a doctrine that would save countless lives, proving that the smallest insights can have monumental consequences in war. Yet, the story is not just about tactics or planes. It is about human ingenuity and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It is about a single pilot who refused to accept defeat, who dared to question the impossible, and who saw a solution where others only saw despair. A box of matchsticks became a tool of strategy, a symbol of creativity, and a beacon of hope for those fighting in the most hostile skies on Earth. The lessons endured long after the war. Pilots remembered the method not because it was easy, but because it worked. They carried the principle forward: understand your enemy, recognize your limitations, and exploit the truth hidden in plain sight. The Zero had been feared as unstoppable, but in the hands of thoughtful, determined men, it could be defeated. And so, the Pacific air became a testament to courage and intelligence combined. Each mission, each dive, each careful maneuver was a story of survival and victory against overwhelming odds. The matchstick pilot's quiet brilliance had shifted the balance, proving that, in war, as in life, insight often outweighs brute force. When the engines finally fell silent at the end of a long day, pilots would look back on the skies they had conquered and remember that it wasn't just their courage or firepower that had saved them. It was thinking differently, seeing beyond the obvious, and daring to turn a simple idea into a life-saving strategy. The Zeros would never again be the untouchable predators of the Pacific, and the story of the man who used matchsticks to unlock their weakness would live on as a legend of ingenuity, courage, and survival. It is a story that reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when failure seems inevitable and fear threatens to overwhelm, human creativity and determination can find a way. And sometimes, the simplest tools, a box of matchsticks, a sharp mind, and relentless observation can change the course of history.